Shabbat Shalom and welcome back to the Septuagint versus the Masoretic channel. Today we're looking at Joshua chapter 10. There are 43 verses, and for this video I want to be a little more efficient. The last video was a little too long for my liking. So 43 verses, and we have a new format in terms of the text portion. All the parts I'm going to mention will have a big M before the line. So using that format, we're going to skip ahead to verse 4. Verse 4, I'm going to mention the word take rather than smite. Smite can mean kill or hurt. Take means to take possession, obviously. Have gone over versus to make peace with. So the observation I noted here was to cross over is the literal definition of the word Hebrew. Okay, so that's verse 4. There's a continuous difference in verse 5 of Adullam versus Hebron. I should say Eglon, not Adullam, not Hebron. So Adullam and Eglon is the difference there. Moving ahead to verse 6. We have a lot of verses to cover. So hill country versus mountains. Joshua chapter 9, in fact, shows that both translations, the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, seem to use both these terms interchangeably. So it's not a wild difference. It seems to be interchangeable. Verse 8, there shall not one of them be left before you. Verses here, shall not a man of them stand before you. So the difference there is being alive and being dead. So we can see that they will not be left, meaning no survivors, versus they will be alive, but they just won't be able to stand. Maybe they'll be paralyzed or they'll have their legs broken. I don't know. Or it could just be an expression, meaning they won't be alive before you. Could be an idiom as well. But again, if you're taking it literally, you don't understand whether this is an idiom or not. It can be taken in the wrong way or the right way, depending on your perspective. Verse 9, and when Joshua came suddenly upon them, versus Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly. So the narrative is, in the Septuagint at least, Joshua used a surprise attack, a strategy, which may imply this was his plan originally, and the words of Yah may have given him increased confidence in his plans. Versus because of these words from Yah, Joshua decided to do a surprise attack. Perhaps he changed his strategy because of the words. Okay, moving ahead to verse 11 now. Talking about at the descent of Oronin versus we're in the going down to Beth Horon. So in the Septuagint, this is a high elevation point, descending from Oronin, versus this could be a hill, or it could even be flat plain. Not necessarily too cumbersome to navigate. Okay, moving ahead to the next part of the verse, talking about the hailstones that killed the enemies. These were hailstones versus these were great stones. Right there. It actually uses hailstones in the second part of the verse, whereas it just says hailstones twice in the Septuagint. Verse 12, into the power of Israel versus into the hand of Israel. Or I should say before Israel, not into the hand, just before them. So why do I point this out? Because if someone is delivered into your power, they are now under your authority. You basically own them. The next part of the verse is when he, whether it's Joshua or God, I'm not sure, when he destroyed them in Gibeon. Where is that? Verse 12. Okay. When he destroyed them. There it is. Verses... and they were destroyed from before the children of Israel. Okay, so that's what it says in the Septuagint. Let the sun stand over against Gibeon, and the moon over against the valley of Ajalon. Versus sun, stand you still upon Gibeon, and you, moon, in the valley of Ajalon. So it's just expressed differently. They were destroyed. Let the sun stand over, and the moon over against Gibeon, or Ajalon. So we can see that Joshua seems to be talking to the sun and the moon like they're people in the Masoretic, versus just describing how he's saying let the sun and let the moon. So he's describing them as objects, referring to them as objects rather than as being personified. Verse 13, the first big difference of this chapter, it says, until God or Elohim executed vengeance on their enemies. So who's the one executing vengeance? It's Elohim. It's Yah himself. This is the big difference. In the Masoretic, who's the one taking vengeance? It says, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. So this is one of the big differences that was pointed out to me by one of my brothers in the faith when he was showing me the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic. This is one of the biggest differences besides Psalm 40, which really was the catalyst for me to start this channel, was Psalm 40. And then we have this one, which could definitely be one of the top 10. If we're going to make a top 10 big differences, it's who has vengeance? Elohim has vengeance. He's the one executing vengeance on the enemies of Israel. It's not the people, it's God himself. And there's an addition. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? That's not actually in the text in this specific chapter. It does mention Jasher in other verses, but not in this verse. That was added on later. It did not proceed to set till the end of one day. That's the sun. Verses, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. So the difference is it did not move. It did not move at all. Versus it did not hurry to go down. Didn't haste to go down, to set. I just want to point out that it says that God should listen to a man versus God listen to the voice of a man. It's one thing to listen to a man. It doesn't have to physically speak or verbalize. It could just have a concern or a desire in his heart, and God would listen to that man. It doesn't have to necessarily mean he has to speak, but in the Masoretic, it is literally the voice of a man. And I think that applies to both genders. It's just mankind. Okay, moving ahead to verse 20. Till they were consumed was added. So they were not consumed, as seen by the latter half of the verse. And then it says here that they escaped, that escaped took refuge in the strong cities, versus that the rest which remained of them entered into fenced cities. So what is the difference here? They had to physically escape, versus they were just left to live. Okay. Verse 21, they returned safely, versus in peace, in quiet or tranquility. Big difference in verse 21. And no one of the children of Israel murmured with his tongue as a result of what had happened. Verses, now this is very head-scratching in the Masoretic. It says, none moved his tongue against any of the children of Israel. So no one from Israel complained in the Septuagint. Makes sense. Why would they complain? They were given the victory by Elohim. Versus none from outside Israel complained. Well, this is illogical. It makes no sense because those from outside Israel have many reasons to complain, especially in part to the deaths and destruction caused by the hailstones. Okay, moving ahead to verse 24. We have all Israel versus all the men of Israel. So it's not just the men, it's everybody. All the people of Israel were called. Versus Joshua only spoke to the captains, as you see in the rest of the verse. Come forward versus come near. Step right up versus step right up and do this versus come closer. So this verse reminds me of the verse where it says, until I make your enemies your footstool. So just think on that. Read that verse over and over and reflect on that. Verse 25, do not fear them, talking about the kings, neither be cowardly, versus fear not, which is a general, all across the board fear, nor be dismayed. So it's one thing to not be cowardly, it's one thing to just say don't be dismayed. So we can see one is a little more, I think, more motivational, really pushes you to be brave. Verse 26, an addition of smote them. So Joshua did not play with them. He did not waste time torturing them. Where in the Masoretic, it looks like he hit them and then he beat them up or killed them and then hanged them. Whereas no, he killed them right away. And he hung them on the 5 trees as a deterrent or as a sign. Verse 27, toward the setting of the sun versus at the time of the going down of the sun. So this seems to be a continuous difference in both translations, especially when it comes to the timing of Passover. Because we know, according to the Septuagint that is, the lambs were killed in the afternoon. Afternoon to evening, so that's around 3 p.m. according to traditions and according to the Septuagint, frankly. Versus the evening. Some say towards the evening, but is it in the evening or is it towards the evening? It's in the afternoon, which is towards the evening. Not in between the evenings in some strange timing that is cryptic. It is 3 p.m. to be exact. But in verse 27, it is toward the setting of the sun. Doesn't say that it's 3 p.m., but most likely it is in the afternoon and before the evening time. Okay, moving ahead to verse 29, I should say verse 30. There's an omission of, and they took it. Why is this important? Because they took possession of this, of Libnah. There's a lot of conquering taking place in this chapter, you'll note. So they killed the inhabitants, they slew them, versus smote it. If you just smote something, it could mean you just hit them, but no, they were killed. There was not left in it any that survived and escaped, versus he let none remain in it. So it is not enough to see that nothing comes into the city, but to also ensure that no one comes out of the city. And you'll see that by the term escaped. Okay, verse 32. They took it versus which took it. So Israel conquered it in the Septuagint versus the time that it took that elapsed. And they put the inhabitants to death versus they smote it. Verse 34. And he besieged it and took it. Versus they encamped against it and fought against it. So they conquered it in the Septuagint versus they were in the process of fighting them still in the Masoretic. Another big difference, the second one, in verse 35, It's an omission of this very important detail. Who does the victory belong to? Who is it? Who gives you the victory? It is Adonai. It is Yah, isn't it? It says here, and the Lord, or Adonai, or Yah, Jehovah, however you want to call him, the tetragrammaton, the name Hashem, delivered it into the hand of Israel. That's a very important detail. And it's important to give credit where credit is due, especially when it comes to giving the honor and the glory to Elohim. Very important. Otherwise, he will not continue to bless you if you don't acknowledge him. It's important that he gets the credit, he gets the glory. Okay, so that's 35. Verses 36, they encamped about it. Verses fought against it. Again, they positioned themselves. Verses they were already in the process of fighting. Verse 37, all the living creatures versus all the souls. Verse 42, moving on ahead. And Joshua smote. And Joshua smote once for all. Versus Joshua take one at one time. Or took at one time. So the difference here is that it's talking about how Joshua conquered all these kingdoms versus the chronological order at which they were taken one at a time. Verse 43, an addition here, and Joshua returned and all Israel with him unto the camp to Gilgal. So I just had a reflection about this chapter. You can see the swiftness and the unstoppable force that Yah is. He used Joshua as a tool to conquer the kingdom, a kingdom after a subsequent kingdom. There were 6 kingdoms conquered, as much as 8 in this chapter alone. I believe, personally, that this is a prototype for how the future Joshua, which is Yehoshua, the anointed, the Messiah, HaMashiach, will likewise conquer each kingdom at his second coming. Kingdom by kingdom will fall, and the news of it will spread like wildfire of his victories, and the nations that end up surrendering or being absolutely wiped out by strategic warfare and divine intervention. So thank you very much for your time. That's Joshua 10. May Yah bless you and make your way prosperous. Shabbat Shalom, Maranatha. Until next time, we'll look at Joshua chapter 11.